Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Z. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in transgender care. Welcome to my channel. Let's talk about imposter syndrome today, a phenomenon that is probably going to be very relevant and very familiar to many of you who are watching this today, because it is a very common thing to experience in transgender community. And I'd like to share with you today just how common it is, and also share with you today what tends to lead to having imposter syndrome and how can you potentially break the cycle of feeling like an imposter. For starters, let's look at what exactly does constitute imposter syndrome. Well, imposter syndrome is a psychological pattern of feeling kind of fear about your own inner self-accomplishments. As a result, it leads to internalized self-doubt that you're going to be discovered at any moment as a fraud. So it's this kind of feelings that what you've done is not really yours. What you've done is not really something that belongs to you, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of achievement. And you're constantly sitting there on the borderline of being afraid that somebody's going to discover that you're really not that great after all. Well, the reality is that apart from transgender people, guess what? A lot of famous people who accomplish anything and everything in life have at one point in their life experience imposter syndrome. In fact, Maya Angelou, an incredible author, has been quoted vocally to express and share that every time she sits down to write, she's afraid that somebody's going to discover that she is a fraud and that she has been lying all along. Now, that's Maya Angelou, including Brené Brown as well, has also spoken about imposter syndrome, and a lot of other famous, successful people. So as you can see, imposter syndrome is not something that is only relevant and highly close to somebody who's struggling with gender dysphoria. It is something that mostly all of us experience at some point in our life, because as we go through life, there's going to be a little segments of things we achieve, a little segments of things we tend to accomplish as we go along the way. So feeling and experiencing imposter syndrome is going to be highly common for mostly everybody. I know for myself for sure, I have also felt and experienced imposter syndrome. That's just how common it is. But it tends to occur in transgender community primarily because as you transition, as you're going through transition, and as you have transitioned and achieved your transitionary goals, whatever they may be for you, part of you starts to feel like imposter. For some of you, there's a bigger part of you that feels like at any time somebody's going to discover that you're a fraud, that you're not really a man or a woman, that you're not really a non-binary, that you're not really a gender queer, you're not really anything in any way you identify in a gender spectrum. It is incredibly common in trans community. I see it all the time. I see it especially so much more with people who have gone through their transition goals. Especially when they start dating, there's this internal fear and terror that somebody is going to think that I'm not woman enough. Somebody's going to think that I'm not man enough. Somebody's going to think that I'm not non-binary enough. This internalized dread, right? Internalized dread of being called out as a fraud is incredibly common. It is so common that I would probably say 99% of trans people tend to experience it. At least I had observed it in 99%. That's a pretty high percentile. And I think one of the biggest reasons why you experiencing the sense of dread is falls into kind of twofold categories. One category is that we unfortunately live in a society that doesn't appreciate the diversity of gender expressions, that is not really fully inclusive and supportive of trans community. And as a result, there is that internal fear and dread that is very realistic and very much based on the current contextual situation we live in. The second primary reason why I think people trans community tend to experience an imposter syndrome is because there's a part of you, a bigger part of you, that hasn't fully accepted your sense of identity as transgender. Let me elaborate on that a little bit more. Well, let's think a little bit about imposter syndrome, okay? So imposter syndrome, again, is doubting what you have accomplished, so doubting who you are, in other words. And it's deeper, underlying all of those fears, really. What imposter syndrome is about it's about not having confidence enough in who you are as that particular individual. So when Maya Angelou is speaking about her fear of being discovered as a fraud, she's also in a way demonstrating there's this not fully embracing confidence of herself as this incredibly successful writer. Now, she may have embraced a complete deeper sense of herself as being a great writer, but a successful and amazing writer that people cherish and love to read, that sometimes for us is very difficult to embrace because a lot of us tend to be a more humble human beings. And so to embrace that, we feel as if we're being overly narcissistic. So the root of the imposter syndrome is really a lot has to do with confidence, and a lot has to do with being able to appreciate our value and hold the values that we bring into this world. And I think for a lot of transgender people, that's sometimes what happens, is that there's a part of you that hasn't fully accepted for yourself that it's okay to be transgender, that it is okay to undergo transition, that it is okay to love yourself as you are. And part of the challenge of accepting that value, of course, again, has to do sadly with society. Whereas for Maya Angelou, it's a little bit easier because society accepts that it's okay to be a successful, highly written, highly quotable author. But for trans people, it is still very challenging because society has not really caught up to be able to provide you that type of support. So I can totally understand why you would get a sense of imposter syndrome. I had a client one time that had a great way of metaphorically talking about imposter syndrome. And the way this person talked about imposter syndrome is the feeling as if you're constantly trespassing a territory where you don't belong. So it's this feeling as if you're visiting particular territory, but you don't really belong on the territory. And I think the sense of trespassing has a lot to do with this ideas of binary views of gender, this use of gender of exclusionary rules, right? You're not man enough if you don't do ABC, you're not woman enough if you don't do ABC. And I think that's really sad and very unfortunate. I think that also leads to a lot of people, a lot of you, to develop imposter syndrome. If you are dealing with imposter syndrome, chances are you are, and you know exactly what I'm talking about, then first of all, acknowledge that it is normal to have this. Everybody has it. All of us have it, regardless whether we're going through gender dysphoria experiences or not. Mostly everybody at some point in their life experience imposter syndrome. So I think just recognizing how common imposter syndrome is can be really helpful and beneficial. And then second, ask yourself what inner work you might do for yourself in order to have confidence and feel much more acceptable of your sense of who you are. How can you be more compassionate and more self-loving, cultivate self-love for yourself as a human being, and really accept the values that you bring to the world, because you do bring tremendous value into the world, and you do bring tremendous value into people that you meet. So how can you work and cultivate on that? And I think once you start cultivating and appreciating yourself and what you bring to the table, that's really going to help with reducing the amount of imposter syndromes that you feel. So that's how you can start breaking the cycle of imposter syndrome. But it is so incredibly common. Don't beat yourself up if you do experience it, because chances are everybody at some point have experienced imposter syndrome, unless you're so incredibly narcissistic and think you're the God's gift to this earth. Other than that, majority of the people who have some kind of sense of conscientiousness, some kind of sense of humbleness, are going to experience, and that's totally normal. The key here is really not to get sunk into all that internalized fear, not to let that fear kind of control you and constantly overtake every single step that you take and every single step that you do in your life. So that's the key, is not to be paralyzed in that fear and in that self-doubt that you're going to be discovered as a fraud, because you're not a fraud. You are who you are. There's nothing fraudulent about you. So remember that. If you're watching this, comment below, because I'm sure this is going to be so common to all of you, and let me know, when did you experience imposter syndrome? Was it in the beginning of transition, while you were going through transition, or was it after you have completed all of your transition goals? Let me know, what did you do to cope with this imposter syndrome? Do you still deal with imposter syndrome on a daily basis, and how is it affecting you? Comment below. As always, I read all of your comments. I comment back to all of your comments. I really enjoy engaging with you in a conversation, so comment below and let me know, and that way we can go on and talk among each other. And hopefully I'll see all of you next time. Bye.